They say empires fall with a whimper, not a bang. But in April 1945, as World War II reached its crescendo, one empire faced its end with both a thunderous storm of artillery, air raids, and desperate last stands echoed across the swamplands of eastern Germany. And at the center of this fury stood a seemingly insignificant line of ridges, the Seelow Heights, modest in appearance, but decisive in fate. Here, just 37 miles from Berlin, the fate of Nazi Germany teetered on a muddy hill, and the Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, was ready to deal the final blow. But what makes a hill become history? Why did thousands die on a patch of farmland, knowing full well the war was already lost? And how did this overlooked battle shape the fate not just of Berlin, but of Europe itself? This is the story of one of the last and bloodiest battles of World War II. A story of stubborn resistance, overwhelming firepower, and the quiet terror of soldiers who knew the end was near. It was April 1945. Nazi Germany, bled dry by years of war, was finally on its knees. To the east, the Red Army stood poised to seize Berlin. Its journey to this point had been brutal. From the frozen ashes of Stalingrad to the streets of Warsaw and Budapest, Soviet troops had clawed their way westward, reclaiming lands taken by the Wehrmacht and capturing new ones. Now, they stood along the Oder and Neisse rivers, facing what would be the final obstacle before reaching Hitler's capital. But even at this late stage, the Nazi regime had no intention of surrendering quietly. Facing annihilation, it threw every remaining resource into the defense of Berlin, and in doing so, transformed the humble Seelow Heights into a fortress, rising just 40 to 60 meters above the surrounding floodplain. The Seelow Heights overlooked the Oderbruck Valley, a swampy, low-lying stretch of land, now saturated by spring thaws and deliberately flooded by German engineers. The Germans had opened upstream reservoirs, turning the ground into a morass of mud and water. Fields that once fed villages had become death traps, lined with mines, trenches, and canal ditches. It was here, on this sodden, killing ground, that General Theodor Busse's Ninth Army prepared to make its final stand. Busse commanded what was left of Army Group Vistula, patchwork of panzer divisions, Volkssturmmilitia, and desperate conscripts. Months of retreat, Allied bombing, and fuel shortages had reduced these once formidable units to battered remnants. Morale was low, ammunition was scarce, soldiers were exhausted, but the terrain favored them. From the high ground of the Seelow Heights, German artillery and machine gunners could rain down fire on the Soviet forces struggling below. Their bunkers were deep, their fields of fire were clear, and their belief, at least for a time, was that the Red Army might yet be stopped. On the other side of the river, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commander of the First Belarusian Front, stood ready. He had over 1 million men under his command, spread across 10 armies. Among them were the 8th Guards Army, the 1st Polish Army, the 5th Shock Army, and the fearsome 1st Guards Tank Army. Supporting them were nearly 9,000 artillery pieces and more than 3 Serral tanks. Behind them buzzed the engines of 4 000 aircraft from the 16th and 18th Air Armies. Zhukov's force was a juggernaut matched in manpower, firepower, and momentum. Yet, he faced a dilemma. Though Berlin was within reach, he could not afford to bypass Seelow. Any flanking maneuver risked German counterattacks against his rear. He had to smash through the heights, head on. A costly decision, but necessary. Zhukov knew this. So did Stalin. So did Hitler. At 3:00 a.m. on the 16th of April, 1945, the battle began. It started with a roar. A bombardment unlike anything the German defenders had ever experienced. More than 9,000 Soviet guns unleashed hell. Mortars, heavy artillery, and truck-mounted Katyusha rockets to Stalin's organs rained destruction on the Seelow front. The ground quaked. Hills trembled. The air split apart with shrieking metal. For 2 hours, the Germans were buried in explosions. The sky lit up in a hellish strobe, and the fields below the heights glowed with fire and smoke. For the Volkssturm young boys, old men, farmers turned fighters sit. Must have felt like the end of the world, but the Germans had prepared their bunkers, dug deep into the hillside, withstood the onslaught. When the barrage finally lifted, they emerged, shaken, but alive, and ready. As the Soviet infantry surged forward across the flooded valley, they ran headlong into a nightmare. Mud sucked at their boots. Tanks bogged down in canal ditches. Smoke blinded their vision. Artillery fell short or overshot. And all the while, German guns opened up from the heights above. Soviet soldiers, silhouetted by searchlights behind them, became easy targets. They died by the hundreds, then the thousands. Zhukov had expected a breakthrough by dawn. He got a bloodbath instead. But even bloodbath can serve a purpose. Wave after wave of Red Army infantry pressed forward, undeterred. Behind them, tank crews worked frantically to recover stuck vehicles, pulling each other from the muck to keep the advance going. The Germans fought back with brutal efficiency. Their machine guns laid down scything fire. Mortars struck regrouping formations. Even the Luftwaffe, though a shadow of its former self, launched desperate air sorties fighters. Bombers, even suicide pilots were hurled into the maelstrom. Yet the Soviets never stopped. Reinforcements poured in. Fresh battalions replaced fallen ones. And Zhukov, furious at the slow progress, ordered renewed assaults on the 17th of April. In the north, the 248th and 301st Rifle Divisions pushed through the village of Guso. In the center, Tank Corps and Rifle Divisions inched closer to Seelow itself. German counterattacks fierce and sudden inflicted casualties but couldn't hold the line. By the 18th of April, the battle was turning. German troops began falling back not in panic, but in tactical withdrawals. They lured Soviet forces uphill into fresh kill zones, but the pressure was unrelenting. And by the 19th of April, the Red Army finally cracked the final line, the Wotan line. The Seelow Heights had fallen. By the evening of the 19th of April, the Seelow Heights were no longer a fortress. They were a graveyard. The German Ninth Army had fought with remarkable resolve, but now it was broken. Scattered across the ravaged terrain, its unit disoriented, fragmented, and in retreat. Some divisions tried to regroup deeper west. Others, realizing the hopelessness of their position, attempted to fall back toward Berlin, but retreat was a cruel illusion. The Soviet advance was now an avalanche. The Red Army had punched a hole through the last coherent line of natural defense east of Berlin. Zhukov knew it. The order was clear. No rest, no pause, no mercy. Push forward, surround the capital, end the war. The town of Seelow, once a sleepy outpost on the Oder, had been pulverized into ruin. Soviet tanks rumbled past smoking craters and collapsed homes. Artillery shells still echoed in the distance, but the rhythm was changeless defensive, more desperate. What lay ahead was Berlin, But Berlin would not fall easily. Let us now take a step back to understand what was truly at stake, both militarily and politically. Marshal Zhukov's assault on Seelow was not merely a tactical choice, it was a political test. Stalin had set the stage for a final Soviet push with enormous symbolic and strategic weight. Berlin was more than a city. It was the heart of Hitler's Reich. Capturing it before the Western Allies was a matter of national pride, ideological dominance, and Cold War positioning. Zhukov knew this. So did his rival, Marshal Ivan Konev, commander of the First Ukrainian Front to the south. In the final weeks of the war, Stalin had deliberately stoked a sense of competition between them. Both commanders were given orders to converge on Berlinic racing from different directions. Seelow was Zhukov's obstacle. Dresden and the Elbe stood in Konev's path. Whoever broke through first would enter Berlin, and whoever entered Berlin would be remembered, immortalized, glorified. Zhukov, always a loyal but ambitious general, knew that this was not just a military campaign, it was the final chapter in the narrative of Soviet victory. He could not afford to lose time or reputation. But his insistence on frontal assault came at a steep cost. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers died at Seelow. For what many historians later called a predictable killing ground, the question remains, could the Red Army have bypassed the Seelow Heights? Could Konev have taken the southern route alone and still encircled Berlin effectively? Perhaps. But to Zhukov, Seelow was not optional, it was essential, a gateway he had to force open, no matter the price. Meanwhile, on the German side, the consequences of defeat at Seelow were immediate and catastrophic. The fall of the Heights tore open the eastern flank of Berlin's defenses. General Gotthard Heinrici, one of the most capable defensive commanders left in the German army, had warned Hitler of this outcome. He had pleaded for a flexible defense, a gradual withdrawal from the Oder to more defensible positions closer to the capital, but Hitler refused. His obsession with holding ground even when tactically unsound had doomed the Ninth Army to a battle of attrition it could not win. Now, with Seelow lost and the Soviets pouring through the breach, Heinrici could only watch as the collapse accelerated. Worse still, Hitler's interference grew erratic. From his Führerbunker beneath the Reichschancellery in Berlin, he issued increasingly delusional commands. Entire divisions were moved on maps, though they no longer existed. He ordered counter-offensives from non-existent units. He dismissed reports of Soviet breakthroughs as lies, defeatism, or cowardice. The reality was starker than he could imagine. The Red Army was at the gates, and now, the question was no longer if Berlin would fall, but how soon. As Soviet forces surged beyond Seelow, their strategy shifted. Zhukov's men didn't march directly into Berlin in a straight line. Instead, they expanded their thrust into a wide encircling movement. The goal was clear trap the German defenders within the city and prevent any organized retreat or reinforcement. In military terms, Berlin was to become a cauldron. To the south, Konev's First Ukrainian Front moved swiftly, crossing the Elbe and enveloping the capital from the southeast. To the north, Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front bore down toward the city's northern outskirts. The Soviets were forming a ring of steel, and inside that ring, chaos. What made Berlin so fiercely contested, even in April 1945, when the war was all but lost? The answer lies not only in military logic, but in ideology. For Nazi leadership, surrender was unthinkable. Berlin was the seat of Hitler's power, the cradle of his thousand-year Reich. To abandon it would be to abandon the myth of invincibility that had sustained the regime. For Soviet leadership, Berlin was the crown jewel of their victory. Capturing it would avenge the horrors of Stalingrad, the siege of Leningrad, the massacres at Babi Yar, and the systematic destruction of their homeland. There was also fear deep and unresolved. Fear that the Western Allies, now pushing through Western Germany, might reach Berlin first. Churchill had long advocated a race for the capital, fearing Soviet expansion into Central Europe, but American Commander Dwight Eisenhower had a different calculus. He viewed Berlin as a symbolic prize, not a strategic one. His priority was crushing the German military machine, especially in the south, where Nazi diehards were preparing a rumored Alpine redoubt in the Bavarian mountains. Thus, Eisenhower gave the Soviets the green light. Berlin would be theirs. And with that knowledge, Zhukov and Konev accelerated their offensive, pushing beyond the Seelow Heights with brutal efficiency. For the civilians of Berlin, the aftermath of Seelow meant only one thing: doom was coming. The thunder of artillery from the east grew louder with each passing hour. Entire neighborhoods fled underground, sheltering in basements and U-Bahn tunnels. Food was scarce. Clean water unreliable. The streets were filled with rubble and whispers. Fear of the Soviets ran deep-stoked for years by Nazi propaganda, warning of Slavic hordes and revenge for atrocities committed in the East. And yet, for many Berliners, there was also quiet resignation. The war was lost. Their city was next. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler met with his shrinking inner circle. On the 20th of April, his 56th birthday, he emerged briefly to greet members of the Hitler Youth and shook hands with children holding Panzerfausts. It would be his last appearance in the daylight. 2 days later, Soviet artillery began striking the city center. Back on the battlefield, the cost of Seelow was becoming clear. The Red Army had suffered staggering casualties in just a few days. Soviet records claim around 33,000 dead. Other estimates suggest the true number was much higher. German losses were lighter, but still devastating. Nearly 12. 0 killed. Tens of thousands captured. Many units had ceased to function altogether. The 9th Army, a proud force, was now shattered beyond repair. Seelow's fields, ridges, and trenches were now a scorched plain littered with broken guns, discarded helmets, and twisted wreckage. Smoke still rose from craters. The moans of the wounded echoed through the hills at night. But the road to Berlin was open, and the storm had only just begun. As the Red Army swept past the ruins of Seelow, what lay before them was not open countryside, but a city transformed into a fortress. Berlin, a name now synonymous with endings. But in April 1945, it was a labyrinth of barricades, tank traps, flak towers, and hopeless defenders clinging to the wreckage of ideology. The fall of the Seelow Heights had torn open the eastern defenses of the Reich, and now Soviet forces closed the ring. The city, once a symbol of Nazi dominance, was about to become the stage for its final collapse. Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front approached from the east and northeast. Marshal Konev's first Ukrainian front surged up from the south, and Rokossovsky's second Belarusian front pressed in from the north. By the 23rd of April, Berlin was fully encircled. The noose had tightened, but what lay within was not yet silent. Berlin's defenders were a strange, pitiful mixture. The remnants of elite SS divisions, strung out Wehrmacht units, Hitler Youth, Volkssturm-Militias, and even civilian volunteers. Boys as young as 12, men as old as 70, armed with outdated rifles, Panzerfausts, and false hope. The once proud German war machine was now a ghost. Most of his tanks had been destroyed or abandoned. The Luftwaffe was nearly non-existent. Ammunition was critically low. Command structure barely held together. Still, they fought street by street, room by room. The Soviets, for all their overwhelming power, were entering a nightmare. Urban combat in Berlin was unlike anything they had seen. Fighting in a ruined city is a form of madness. There are no front lines, only rubble, basements, snipers, ambushes. Every building is a potential stronghold. Every sewer a tunnel of death. Zhukov's men advanced cautiously, but losses mounted. Tanks were ambushed at close range by defenders hiding behind walls or beneath staircases. Whole blocks were booby-trapped. Sappers had to clear explosives from stairwells while bullets ricocheted around them. Flamethrowers became essential. So did grenades. So did raw endurance. Amidst the fire and concrete, Berlin civilians suffered the most. Those who hadn't fled months earlier now huddled in the shadows, starving, trembling, praying. The city's infrastructure had collapsed. Water mains burst. Electricity was sporadic. The wounded lay in school gymnasiums turned into makeshift hospitals. Doctors had no morphine, no bandages. Priests moved from bunker to bunker, offering the last rites in whispers over the dead and dying. And through it all, the Soviets advanced inside the Führerbunker. Hitler was unraveling. News from the front grew worse by the hour. His orders to mobilize armies that no longer existed went unheeded. He cursed his generals, accused them of betrayal. Then he sank into silence. His world had shrunk to a concrete tomb beneath the chancellery. With him were Eva Braun, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and his family, SS officers, stenographers, doctors, and a few loyal aides. On the 22nd of April, he acknowledged what others had known for weeks. The war was lost. He told his staff that he would stay in Berlin, that he would not surrender, that he would die there. What followed was not a noble end, but a grim descent. Outside, the battle intensified. On the 25th of April, Soviet and American troops linked up at Torgau on the Elbe River, effectively slicing Germany in half. The Western Allies stopped their advance toward Berlin, leaving the Soviets to take the city. The Red Army poured into the heart of the capital, tightening the siege. By the 26th of April, the Reichstag, the symbol of German parliamentary power, was in sight. But it was no easy prize. The area surrounding it had been heavily fortified. The Reichstag itself, now just a shell, had been turned into a bunker. Machine guns, snipers, and anti-tank weapons were entrenched in its ruins. What followed was one of the most brutal and symbolic fights of the entire war. For the Soviets, capturing the Reichstag was not just strategic, it was emotional. This was the house of the enemy, the place where Hitler's Reich had declared itself. Zhukov had ordered the capture of the building to be completed before May 1, May Day, the most important Soviet holiday. And his troops responded with fury. The assault began on the 29th of April. Grenades, mortars, flamethrowers, room to room, floor to floor. Soviet soldiers scratched their names into the walls with knives and charcoal. The Reichstag burned. Still, the Germans fought on. Finally, on the 30th of April, after hours of carnage, the Soviet red banner was raised atop the Reichstag. The photograph taken of that moment later, staged and reshot, would become one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. A red flag flying over the ruins of Nazi pride. It was over. Almost that same day, deep beneath Berlin, Adolf Hitler shot himself in a small sitting room of the Führerbunker. He and Eva Braun, his wife of just one day, took their own lives Goebbels followed on May 1. After poisoning his 6 children, other Nazi officials tried to flee or begged for mercy from the approaching Soviets. On May 2, the remaining defenders of Berlin surrendered. Soviet troops entered the bunker. They found the burned remains of Hitler and Braun, partially cremated, lying in a shallow crater. Goebbels was dead nearby. The war in Europe was effectively over, but what of the legacy? What did Seelow, Berlin, and the closing days of the Third Reich leave behind? First, the cost. The Battle of Seelow Heights and the Battle of Berlin together claimed the lives of more than 100 nil Soviet soldiers. German military deaths are estimated between 90,000 and 100. Ling. Civilian casualties in Berlin ranged from 20,000 to 30. Ling. Thousands more were injured, displaced, or lost in the chaos. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath fire and rubble. But beyond the human cost was the geopolitical cost, the fracture line of Europe itself. When Berlin fell, the Red Army stood not just as victor but as occupier. Soviet troops controlled all of Eastern Germany and much of Central Europe. In the months that followed, as Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, American, British, and French, a new battle began. Not one of tanks and trenches, but of influence. The Cold War was born from the ashes of Berlin, and the Seelow Heights, those muddy ridges east of the Oder, became the place where that future was decided. A future of walls, fires, and mistrust, of nuclear brinkmanship and propaganda, of Berlin divided, and all because a river was crossed and a hill was taken at any cost. When the guns fell silent in Berlin, the world did not breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath, because though the war had ended in fire and blood, the peace that followed would be cold, divided, and uncertain. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Berlin, the victorious Allies convened to shape the post-war order, but their unity, forged in the heat of war, began to fracture amid the cooling embers. What emerged was not reconciliation, but a new front line, one invisible, but no less dangerous. And the Seelow Heights, though now silent still, cast a shadow. The Yalta Conference, held in February 1945, as the battles for Seelow and Berlin loomed, had already drawn rough outlines for Europe's future. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin agreed that Germany would be disarmed and divided, that free elections would be held in liberated nations, that a United Nations would be formed. But beneath the handshakes and communiques, distrust festered. By the time the Potsdam Conference convened in July 1945, the dynamics had changed. Roosevelt was dead. Churchill had been voted out of office mid-conference. Only Stalin remained the immovable figure of continuity in a rapidly shifting world. His Red Army now occupied most of Eastern Europe. What began as a temporary military presence quickly hardened into political control. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany soon saw communist regimes rise under Soviet influence. Free elections, promised at Yalta, were manipulated or ignored altogether. Berlin, too, was divided, its western sectors controlled by the United States, Britain, and France, its eastern half controlled by the Soviet Union. The city became a microcosm of the global struggle that would define the next half-century. And the first real battle of the Cold War, ironically, was not fought with bullets. It was fought with airplanes. In 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, cutting off all ground access to the western sectors. Their goal: forced the Allies to abandon the city. Instead, they got the Berlin airlift. For nearly a year, Allied cargo planes flew over Soviet lines to deliver food, coal, and medicine to the isolated population of West Berlin, day and night, flight after flight. At its height, one plane landed every 30 seconds. The message was clear: Berlin would not fall again. The blockade was lifted in 1949, but the city remained divided physically, politically, spiritually, and the fault line that began at Seelow now stretched across all of Europe. But even as the Cold War set in, the memory of the Eastern Front and battles like Seelow remained potent. For the Soviet Union, the Great Patriotic War became the cornerstone of national pride. The sacrifices made at Stalingrad, Kursk, and Seelow were enshrined in monuments and textbooks. Victory Day, celebrated each year on May 9, became a sacred date, a moment not just of remembrance, but of identity. Marshal Zhukov, the architect of the Seelow breakthrough, was paraded as a hero, though not without controversy. After the war, Stalin, ever wary of rivals, sidelined Zhukov from command. He would later return under Khrushchev, but his post-war career was marked more by politics than battlefield glory. For Germany, the memory was more fractured. In East Germany, the communist regime embraced the Soviet version of history. The fall of Berlin was liberation, not defeat. The sacrifices at Seelow were glorified as part of the anti-fascist struggle. But in West Germany, the narrative was more complex. The Wehrmacht's defense of the Seelow Heights, while tactically valiant, was seen in retrospect as a final, senseless bloodletting ordered by a delusional regime. Thousands had died to delay the inevitable, and the question lingered: was it worth it? This question would echo through generations, not only among soldiers and historians, but among families. For the veterans of the Ninth Army, a few would speak of Seelow in the decades that followed. Survivors were scattered, captured, or buried in unmarked graves beneath the fields they once defended. In Soviet Russia, veterans carried medals but also scars. Some were proud, others haunted. They had stormed through mud and machine gun fire, buried comrades in the flooded ditches of the Oder, watched Berlin burn. Victory had come, but at a price. One of the enduring ironies of the Battle of Seelow Heights is how small the terrain truly is. Today, a traveler can stand atop the ridge and see across the Oder plain in all directions. The battlefield fits within a modest patch of farmland and forest. Yet, in those few square miles, tens of thousands fought and died in one of the war's most ferocious final battles. There are plaques now, and museums, and silent rows of gravestone Soviet, German, Polish, but nature has reclaimed much. The trenches have softened, the scars have faded into grass, and the floodplain, once a hellish morass of mines and blood, is once again green and quiet. For the modern observer, Seelow may seem a footnote, a mere precursor to the fall of Berlin. But it was more than that. Seelow was the final stand of a crumbling empire, a place where myth collided with reality, where the last embers of Nazi militarism met the unstoppable tide of Soviet vengeance. It was also a warning that even in the final hours of a war, when the outcome is all but certain, the dying does not stop, that leaders clinging to fantasy will sacrifice thousands for hours of delay, and that history, when it comes roaring down, does not knock gently. As the decades passed, the Cold War eventually thawed. Germany was reunified in 1990. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But the echoes of Seelow live on in the lessons taught in military academies, in the memoirs of those who fought there, in the whispered stories of families on both sides of the former Iron Curtain, and in the quiet ridge where spring rains still flood the lowlands, just as they did in April 1945. History often treats battles like math. Numbers, maps, arrows, a before and after. But the Battle of Seelow Heights, like so many in the final year of World War I resist that simplicity because it was not just about strategy or geography. It was about desperation and belief. Desperation from a German army that no longer had the means to win, but still obeyed orders to fight. Belief from a Soviet army that, after 4 years of apocalyptic suffering, was now at the gates of vengeance. In this way, Seelow was not a standard military engagement. It was an emotional collision. Let's return briefly to the Soviet side to understand what drove men to charge headlong into such carnage. The Soviet soldier in 1945 had seen everything: cities burned, families slaughtered, friends frozen in foxholes, retreats ordered under pain of death, advances demanded regardless of cost. By the time they reached the Oder, many were on their third or fourth campaign, and now they were within reach of Berlin. Their rage, barely concealed during the march westward, exploded in full during the final battles. Fueled by years of propaganda, battlefield trauma, and personal loss, the Red Army's final push was one of both triumph and terror. Even among Soviet commanders, discipline began to strain. There are well-documented accounts, often suppressed in Soviet Archivasov mass executions, widespread looting, and horrifying abuses against civilians in Eastern Germany. Entire towns were ransacked, women brutalized, homes torched. A campaign of vengeance played out across the countryside. Marshal Zhukov, who oversaw the Berlin offensive, later admitted the horror, though he insisted it was not condoned. Tried to stop soldiers who have crossed thousands of kilometers of fire and blood. He said, "You'll see what kind of discipline they have left." To the Soviet mind, Seelow was merely the prelude. Berlin was the prize. But many historians argue it was Seelow, not the Reichstag, that best symbolized the Soviet war effort. Why? Because it encapsulated the overwhelming force, brutal cost, and relentless pressure that had come to define the Eastern Front. Soviet strategy at Seelow was blunt but effective. Break the line. Accept losses. Keep going. There was no subtlety, no surprise, no maneuver warfare. It was a bulldozer approach, slow, devastating, and unstoppable. And it worked, but not without a cost that would echo through Soviet society for generations. On the German side, Seelow was also a moment of bitter reckoning. General Theodor Busse, who commanded the Ninth Army, had no illusions about victory. He knew that the Red Army had superiority in every category: manpower, artillery, armor, and air support. But he was given orders, and he followed them. Later, he would write, "The Seelow Heights were not held to defend the nation, but to delay a verdict." And delay they did briefly, but in doing so, they condemned tens of thousands to death. It is one of the defining tragedies of late war Germany that so many soldiers died not in service of victory, but in the shadow of delusion. By 1945, Hitler was not planning strategy, he was rewriting reality. He spoke of miracle weapons, of Steiner's counterattack, of redemption, of reversal. Meanwhile, his armies bled out in flooded trenches. The aftermath of Seelow had another subtler legacy often overlooked. It shaped the memory of World War II in Germany in starkly different ways depending on which side of the Berlin Wall you were born. In the West, where the narrative of Nazi defeat was framed as a national shame, followed by democratic rebirth, battles like Seelow were rarely commemorated. There were memorials for the victims of war, especially civilians, but the Wehrmacht's final stands were not celebrated. In the East, however, things were different. Under the German Democratic Republic (GDR), the communist regime emphasized the heroism of the Soviet soldier and the villainy of fascism. Seelow was turned into a symbol of liberation. Soviet war cemeteries were maintained with reverence. School children were taught that the Red Army had freed them from tyranny, yet many East Germans knew the truth was more complicated. They had seen both the Nazis and the Soviets. They had lost family to both. They had watched cities destroyed in both directions. Seelow, for them, was not a victory. It was a wound. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was erected, concrete, barbed wire, guard towers dividing a city and symbolizing a world split in two. For nearly 3 decades, Berlin remained the front line of the Cold War. And just miles to the east, the Seelow Heights slumbered. Tourists rarely visited. Locals moved on. The ditches over which tanks once struggled filled with wildflowers. The bunkers rusted. The land healed slowly. But beneath the surface, memory stirred. When the wall fell in 1989, it marked the beginning of a new era. Germany was reunified. The Soviet Union dissolved, and the histories once buried by ideology came to light in the 1990s and early 2000s. German and Russian historians revisited Seelow with fresh eyes. Archives were opened. Eyewitnesses interviewed. A clearer picture emerged, less heroic, more human. The battle was no longer told in binary terms of good versus evil, liberation versus resistance. It became a story of complexity, of men trapped by fate, of soldiers fighting because they were ordered to, not because they believed. It became a space for mourning, not triumph. Today, at the Seelow Heights Memorial, a visitor can walk among the trenches and see the ridges where machine guns once cut down advancing waves of Soviet infantry. There is a museum, a collection of preserved bunkers, a mass grave. Every spring, small ceremonies are held, not in glory, but in remembrance. Veterans no longer attend. Most are gone, but their descendants still come. Some bring flowers. Some bring silence. Some bring questions no historian can answer. What did it mean? Why did it happen this way? What would they have done had they been born on the other side of the river? In the end, Seelow was not a battle that changed the course of the war. The war's outcome was already sealed, but it did change the way the world remembers how that war ended and what it cost, because in the final days of World War II, when victory was all but certain, Seelow reminded everyone, victory still demands sacrifice. And history is not made only by the battles we choose, but also by the ones we cannot avoid. There is a strange silence that follows the end of a war. Not the celebratory silence of fireworks or the parade ground quiet before the anthem, but the hollow, uncertain quiet that lingers in places like Seelow, where thousands died for a regime already collapsing, where families waited for letters that would never come, where the earth, once shattered by shells, had to grow green again. And in that silence, there are questions that still linger. 80 years later, what if Zhukov had gone around the Seelow Heights? What if Hitler had ordered a withdrawal instead of a last stand? What if the Western Allies had pushed to Berlin first? These what-ifs are not the tools of armchair generals. They are the echoes of real decisions made by real menunder, real pressure. Zhukov, for all his brilliance, was not above error. His decision to push through Seelow at full force, frontal assault and all, cost tens of thousands of lives in just 4 days. Some of his subordinates suggested bypassing the heights to the north or south, flanking the defenders and saving time. But Zhukov could not afford hesitation. Stalin was watching, Konev was racing, and Berlin was the prize. In war, ambition and fear are twin engines. At Seelow, they roared. The German command, for its part, was no less trapped. General Busse was not a fanatic. He knew the odds. He had seen the collapse on the Eastern Front. He had begged for reinforcements that never came, pleaded for strategic withdrawals that were denied by Hitler's increasingly erratic orders. He fought because to disobey was to be executed, because the men under his command expected leadership even when there was no hope. In his memoirs, Busse did not glorify Seelow. He called it a cruel necessity, a delaying action meant to buy time for civilians to flee, for divisions to retreat, for the army to reorganize west of Berlin. But none of that truly happened. The Soviets were too fast, the encirclement too tight, the collapse too complete, and then there is the final irony, one that hangs like a shadow over the whole campaign, that even as the Seelow Heights were drenched in blood, negotiations for Germany's unconditional surrender had already begun. On May 7, 1945, just weeks after the battle, German General Alfred Jodl signed the instrument of surrender in Reims, France. A second signing followed in Berlin on May 8 to satisfy Soviet demands. The Third Reich's grand visions, its armies, its propaganda was gone. But Seelow, and places like it, had made sure it died, screaming. Let us not forget the others, those caught between the lines. The civilians of the Oder Valley were among the first to witness the Red Army cross into German soil. Many fled some west toward Allied lines, others into forests and basements. Some remained, hoping the battle would pass over them. It did not. The spring floods that made the battlefield so treacherous also made it nearly impossible to evacuate. Villages were cut off, farms submerged, refugees dragged carts through waist-deep mud, children clinging to soaked coats. And when the front line swept through, it spared no one. Among the Soviet dead at Seelow were not just Russians. There were Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians, Armenians, Poles, and even soldiers from Central Asia and the Baltics. For them, Berlin was more than revenge. It was a promise that their suffering in Minsk, in Kiev, in Smolensk would not go unanswered, that the invaders who had burned their homes and slaughtered their kin would fall, and fall they did. But the cost, once paid, left little satisfaction. One Soviet survivor wrote years later, "When we stood on the hill after the battle, I felt nothing. Not pride, not joy, just exhaustion. I thought of my brother, who died outside Leningrad, and I asked myself, was it enough?" History is rarely neat. It resists closure, it offers lessons, but no guarantees, and it punishes arrogance with exacting cruelty. Seelow is one of those stories, a tale of hills soaked in ambition and blood, of generals competing for glory, of ideologies meeting in fire, of soldiers too young to shave lying beside veterans who'd seen 3 fronts. It is, in every way, a story of the end, but like all endings, it also contains a beginning, because the road from Seelow didn't just lead to Berlin, it led to the Berlin Wall, to the Iron Curtain, to nuclear silos, proxy wars, and 5 decades of geopolitical chess. It led to Korea, to Vietnam, to Hungary in 1956, Prague in 1968, and Afghanistan in 1979. The Cold War was not a pause in history. It was a new battlefield, born not in peace treaties, but in the ruins east of Berlin. And Seelow was the hinge, the place where one world closed, and another, colder one began to open. Today, as you stand atop the Seelow Heights, nothing screams of war. There is no thunder, nor smoke, just the wind whispering through the trees and the gentle roll of green fields stretching east toward the river Oder. But beneath your feet meters below the soil still lie the fragments of a battle that shaped the fate of Europe. Shards of helmets, rusted weapons, bits of shrapnel embedded in old roots, and the bones of those who never left. History does not always mark its most important places with grandeur. Sometimes, it chooses a muddy hill and turns it into a hinge of fate. For the people of Seelow today, the war is a memory passed down. The museum at the foot of the ridge welcomes school children, veterans' families, and curious travelers. The walls are lined with artifacts, Red Army maps, photographs of the shattered town, fragments of a Soviet Katyusha shell. Out in the fields, a few concrete bunkers still stand, half sunk into the earth, covered with moss. Here and there, signs warn visitors not to stray too farther, are still places where old mines and explosives may linger. Time has softened the scars, but it has not erased them. And yet, perhaps Seelow's most powerful legacy is not found in its fields, but in the way it asks us to think about endings. We often imagine the end of World War II as a clean break, a moment of celebration, of flags raised, of tyranny vanquished and peace restored. But Seelow reminds us that even the end of a war can feel like another kind of beginning, one shaped by fatigue, brutality, and unanswered questions. The people who fought there on both sides did not step back into normal life. They carried the mud of the Oder, the screams of their comrades, and the weight of what they had done or failed to do. Some would find peace. Others never did. The scars of Seelow lived on in broken families, in decades of political tension, in whispered memories shared over kitchen tables and passed down to children who would never see the hill as it was. But for us, for those looking back from the safety of history, Seelow also offers something more, a warning. That war does not end with surrender, that even in the final hour, leaders will send thousands to their deaths for symbolism, pride, or illusion, that the bloodiest battles are often those least necessary and perhaps most haunting of all, that the most important fights in history are not always the ones that win glory. They're the ones that try and fail to stop the inevitable. Marshal Georgy Zhukov would go on to preside over the Soviet victory parade in Moscow. His role in the Battle of Berlin and at Seelow secured his place in Soviet legend. But even he would fall victim to Stalin's paranoia. Stripped of power before being slowly rehabilitated years later, General Theodore Boussay survived the war. Captured by the Soviets, he was released in 1950 and returned to West Germany. He lived into old age, writing quietly about the decisions that cost thousands of lives. His name, largely forgotten today, remains etched into the records of one of history's last desperate defenses. The Soviet Union, which had paid such a staggering price for victory, would itself collapse just 46 years later peacefully. But no less completely than the Reich it had defeated, Germany was reborn. Once split, then reunited. Once vilified, then admired. And though its history bears deep scars, it also holds lessons few others can teach. In the end, the Seelow Heights teach us this: that geography can shape destiny, that ideas when weaponized can march men into mud and fire, and that even a war almost won can demand a final, terrible toll. There are no monuments vast enough to capture what Seelow meant in April 1945. No plaque or photo or reenactment can recreate what it felt like to charge across a flooded plain into machine gun fire, or to sit in a bunker knowing death was minutes away. But if we listen, really listen, to the voices of those who stood on that ridge, to the silence that followed, to the long years of division and memory that came after, then maybe we can learn not just what happened, but why it must never happen again. You've been watching Legacy Files. If this story moved you, if you believe history must be preserved in all its complexity, subscribe to our channel. We tell the stories that textbooks overlook, the battles that echo into today, the people who stood at the edge of history and made a choice. Thank you for watching. And as always, we'll see you in the next file.